Welcome back. The death of the University of Cape Town's Dean of Health Sciences, Professor Bongani Mayosi, has led the country to once again pay attention to the silent scourge of depression. It appears Professor Mayosi had committed suicide after battling depression and died at a relatively young age of 51. This mental illness, depression, is common, but least diagnosed as it does not present obvious symptoms and has a variety of stigma attached to it. Many people live with it without being aware. It affects individuals and has impact on relationships, self-esteem, productivity, and society at large. To understand what depression is, I have invited our guest from the South African Depression and Anxiety Group, clinical psychologist Charity Mkone. Charity, pleasure to have you with us, ma'am.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we can say depression, but one wonders, what is it? Because we've got a wide range of mental illnesses out there, right? And this particular one, I also have said, has got stigma attached to it. Because like cultural this, cultural that. But let's do the clinical diagnosis of depression first, so that we can familiarize ourselves with what we're talking about.
Okay, so depression is, contrary to popular belief, a very serious mental illness, and it presents in a variety of ways, but the most common thing is a persistent sadness, a loss of interest in activities one had previously enjoyed, sleeping problems, either oversleeping or insomnia, a lack of appetite, overeating or undereating. So it can be those symptoms, those are the very obvious symptoms, and of course the most overriding one is the sadness and the hopelessness that someone who is suffering from this illness would present with or would have. And that has to be persistent for about 2 weeks to be a major depressive episode, and longer, so up to 6 months for it to be a major depressive disorder.
So, okay, that it will become a disorder if it's persistent for longer, right?
Untreated, if it goes untreated.
But when you live with the symptoms for whatever period of time, it's just regarded as an illness. How do you differentiate it from other similar type illnesses? Because sometimes you may have a panic attack or have some anxiety problems and so forth. Will these be in the same family of illnesses that you ultimately call depression, or it will be regarded as different from those?
It's regarded slightly different because it's a mood, so it falls under a cluster that is a mood disorder. Yeah. Meaning that it affects your emotions and how you feel. So this feeling of sadness is what is a big thing in a diagnosis of depression and for someone who's living with depression. So it's a deep and a pronounced and prolonged sadness and a void or a sense of hopelessness that the person experiences, regardless of what is happening around them. So something that can be distinguished from depression. So for instance, if someone is recently bereaved or is grieving and is feeling sad as a result of that, we rule out depression, and there are some some medical or physiological illnesses that we need to rule out before we can diagnose someone with depression. But it usually, when it starts impacting or impeding the person's functioning in their daily life, so they can't concentrate in their jobs, they can't keep social relationships, and it really impacts on the quality of their lives and their jobs, then it becomes something that can necessitate a diagnosis of depression.
But people who live with depression sometimes are not even aware that they are depressed, isn't it? And you can imagine people they live with or who are with them, whether at work or in a family situation. What kind of things, I mean, for a clinical psychologist like yourself, would you say are telltale signs that somebody is living with depression?
So I think the big one is suicide. So people who struggle or suffer from depression often speak about suicide. So family members will probably say, he often spoke about wanting to die, or in very subtle ways, people would say, I just want to sleep for very long and not wake up. So that sense of wanting to make it stop or make the sadness or the feeling of sadness end. And it's things that people will say in very subtle ways if people don't have a language or word to say that I'm feeling depressed. And a sense of hopelessness that no matter what happens, no matter what they try, they don't have a sense that things will be okay. They don't have a hope or a sense that things can get better, things can be okay. And something that's very important to note is that it's not just an illness that affects your mood and affects how you feel and your outlook on life, but it's also biological. So there's certain things that are happening chemically and biologically which make it very difficult for the person to snap out of it. Like people think that you can just be happy.
When somebody says, I'm not feeling good today, I'm feeling lousy, and then the immediate response advice people get given is, no, you'll get out, get over it.
Yeah, you'll get over it. Days are not the same, you'll be fine, you'll feel better tomorrow. But to understand that because depression is an illness, it is impossible for the person without treatment to be able to snap out of it or to get out of that cycle. And that is what leads then to suicide, attempts of suicide, or even a successful suicide, committing of suicide.
Now, because people are less likely to be aware or recognize the fact that this is an illness, including those who may be with them, then they are least likely to go out and receive medical attention.
Yes.
So under what circumstances, or when should, if you're associated with someone who's living with or suffering from depression, what should you do if you notice that something is not right with this person?
So as soon as is possible, to refer the person to a mental health practitioner, so either a psychologist or a psychiatrist. So if someone is diagnosed with depression, they would most likely need to take medication. So the medication helps with the chemical balance and just stabilizing the person. And of course, depression is usually triggered by certain things or certain events or things that happen, circumstances that the person finds themselves in at that point in time. But it needs to be treated first with medication, and then to talk through probably the cause of the depression, or to help the person cope with emotions that may overwhelm them when they're facing a depression. So it's very important that the person goes to a mental health practitioner and receives treatment for it.
And what are the typical triggers?
So typical triggers could be adjustment. So if someone has something that's new that's happening in their life that seems overwhelming, it can be things like losing one's job, relationship difficulties, and it can be a variety of things. So financial strains can put people, or makes people susceptible to having depressive episodes or being diagnosed with major depression. And
particular age groups or genders that may be susceptible to this, or it affects everybody?
So the age group that's most common, so between the ages of 15 and 44, that's where it's commonly seen to be prevalent in those age groups. And men do get affected just as much as women. So it doesn't discriminate in terms of gender. But the stats that we've seen is that men are more likely, so 5 times more likely to commit suicide and be successful in their attempts than women are. And to note, something that's very important, that untreated depression, unfortunately and very sadly, usually leads to suicide.
Now, you mentioned something about the language that we use. We also made reference to the stigma, right? And I think it is particularly prevalent in the black community, where even along gender lines, people are not emotionally expressive enough, would not say, I'm not feeling good, or I'm incapable of doing such and such. So can you talk about this a bit? We know even, some prominent people have said that there's no language for that, and the condition does not exist in the black community.
I mean, that is such a sad phenomenon, something that's very difficult, because it then stops people from trying to access the help and receive the help and also make use of the help when they do get it. And there's a narrative around particularly black communities of strength, that in order to be a strong black woman or a strong black man, then that an expression of emotions of vulnerability, or an expression of emotions at all, is something that's forbidden. And it's seen as something that is for weaker people, people who cannot deal with life or deal with life's difficulties. And it makes it extremely difficult for people, even though they're feeling that they're not okay and they do need the help, that even for the person or the sufferer of depression, to feel like it's okay for them to receive the help. And most importantly, to see it as an illness, that if someone has diabetes, for instance, or hypertension, it's easy for them to take the chronic medication, with some adjustment. But because people don't see it and frame it as an illness, it becomes very difficult. It's not seen as an illness, but rather as a weakness. And that is a stigma. That's a big stigma.
And also, as you said earlier on, the expectation that somehow it will disappear, it will go away, and you do need professional help. And if you are feeling under pressure, then you have to phone organizations such as SADAG, at least to be given online counseling?
Yes, most certainly. So there's telephonic 24-hour telephonic hotline that you can call at SADAG in order to receive the help. So there's a suicide crisis hotline. There's also a 24-hour counseling hotline. So it's staffed with trained counselors who are able to contain the situation and also refer you to a relevant place where you can go and receive face-to-face help.
Now, the situation in recent times, in past 10, 20 years or so, is very difficult economically. A lot of people have been without jobs for a long time. They're battling to cope. Social media, and that's why I put those pictures there up there. Can you briefly comment on social media and the impact of joblessness on a person's mental well-being?
So I think I'll start with the issue of joblessness, which is something that's very unfortunate because it leaves a lot of people feeling quite hopeless and also helpless to do anything about their situation. And I think it can be something that is a stressor that adds to people's general stress and that renders the person feeling quite hopeless about their situation. It doesn't always mean that someone who is jobless or someone who's unemployed has depression, but it certainly can be a precursor and it is something that makes a person susceptible to a mental health issue or mental illness.
Due to the pressures. And just briefly on social media?
And on social media, I think it's the pressure that people put up lives and put up certain images on social media that either they aspire to be or being. And the people around them who perceive that and see that place immense pressure on themselves because their lives look nothing or are very remotely similar to what they see on social media.
Yeah. And I'm imagining also for much younger children who may not have the vocabulary to express how they feel, there's also a problem there. So now, I'm just picking up from what you said as we end the interview, that please also look at the children. You see, if they're not their usual selves and they're not upbeat and somehow, there could be something wrong with them, right? And just take them for some medical attention of sorts, or take them to a psychologist to do a diagnosis, if any, and then give them appropriate help. And if you are battling with the stresses of life yourself, you feel like it's heavy going, again, go to SADAG or go to any of the professionals who might help. And Charity Mkone, thank you very much for coming around here and talking to us. We appreciate it. That's all we had for you here on the program tonight with Tim Modise. We invite you to be with us again next week. And from us, good night to you.